Hi guys, my name is Erica and welcome to this vlog. This weekend is mini Polarthon and so I decided to participate and vlog what I read this weekend. So Polarthon is a readathon hosted by Jade from JD Ray Reads, and it's typically hosted for a week in the month of February, and the entire point of Polarthon is to read polar fantasy. And she decided that this year, instead of waiting until February, she would host a mini Polarthon now in the month of December, which I think is great, and I'm very excited to participate. I don't know that I've ever read a polar fantasy. I guess, sorry, Lily is knocking over my tripod over here. I guess like Lion Witch in the Wardrobe would be a polar fantasy. Basically, a polar fantasy is a fantasy set in like a polar or wintry or Arctic setting. Basically, for this mini Polarthon, the only requirements to participate are to read at least one polar fantasy and to have a weekend of self-care, which I think is so great. I could use one of those. Obviously, you could try to read as many polar fantasies as you wanted, but for me, I am going to stick to one book this weekend in addition to some other things that I'm going to do that sort of fall into that sort of self-care weekend. But I also have some other things that I'm wanting to read that are not polar fantasy, but I do have one. I have one polar fantasy that made it onto my December TBR, and that is The Bear and the Nightingale by Katherine Arden. So this is the one that I'm going to be reading this weekend. I will probably go ahead and start it tonight, obviously, since all of Friday is included in Polarthon. I have today, Friday, tomorrow, Saturday, and then I have Sunday basically to read this book, which is totally doable, especially if I am also using the audiobook, I think, because part of the reason why I'm using the audiobook, I'm a little intimidated by this book, honestly. So this book is about a girl named Vasya, it's V-A-S-Y-A, and this book takes place in medieval Russia and is based very heavily on Russian folklore. And this girl, Vasya, is very familiar with these fairy tales that she has heard her entire childhood, one of which includes a winter demon. Yeah, the blue-eyed winter demon named Frost. And like, I think she has some sort of connection to him or to like the spirits of the forest or something like that. I'm wondering if there's like a sort of witchcraft element, especially considering the titles of the other books in this trilogy. This is the first book in the Winter Night trilogy, which I may or may not continue depending on if I like this book. But I think what intimidates me most, one, it's fantasy, which I don't really read a whole lot of, so there's that. But also I've heard it's very dense, or very, maybe not dense, but slow. Like, it's, especially in the beginning, like this is the first in the series, and so it's sort of building the world and everything for us, and so I've just heard it's very slow going. And so I'm a little nervous about that and how much I'm gonna actually like get into it. So that's part of why I decided to, in addition to the physical copy, also have the audiobook so that I can maybe listen along as I'm reading, but I can also just listen while I'm doing some other things this weekend. And I do have some other thoughts on some things that I want to do as part of my little self-care mini Polarthon weekend. So yeah, I thought that I would just pop in and let you know what it is that I am going to be reading this weekend. And yeah, we will see how this goes, and I will take you along. is Saturday, and last night I ordered Chinese for dinner, and while I ate that, I watched the most recent episode of Grey's Anatomy. Huge Grey's Anatomy fan, in case you were wondering. And then I did start The Bear and the Nightingale, which is my chosen polar fantasy for this weekend, except I did not get very far. I read the first few chapters and then I was like, I'm gonna go to bed. And then today I slept in really late and did a whole lot of nothing. I went and did some grocery shopping, ran some errands, and long story short, it's basically Saturday night, and I still have not read any more of this book. I am currently on page 29, start of chapter 4. And yeah, I have some reading to catch up on if I want to try and get this read before the end of this weekend, but I am liking it so far. I have kind of my list of like names going because first of all, this story takes place in Russia. A lot of the terms that they're using, including all of their names, are Russian. And there are a handful of characters in this family, and so I was getting them kind of confused about who was who and like the birth order of all the children and that sort of thing. So I started writing some of those down, which I think is going to have to be a thing that I do if I continue to read some of these like lengthier fantasies. There's a lot of characters usually with a lot of weird names that I will likely get confused if I don't take notes. So I've started to take some notes on each of these characters. It didn't quite start the way that I was anticipating. So the main character is Vazia, and she like doesn't exist yet in the start of the story. It actually starts before her birth, and you get some of the backstory of her grandmother actually, who married like this Russian prince and had like these magical powers, and her mother is pretty certain that when she is born, Vazia will also have these magical powers. So now at the point that I'm at, which is still not very far into the book, she's like 6 years old. And it was kind of sad because from the description, obviously, it talks about how Vazia's father is widowed and how she gets a stepmother and how there's like some conflict obviously there between her and the stepmother. So her mom does die in the beginning of this, and that's sad. I am really enjoying this so far. It's not quite as slow or dense as I feel like I was led to believe based on some of the other sort of reviews of this. We'll see what I think going forward because I really am only a few chapters in. And obviously it's not so intriguing that I picked it up earlier today because I'm just now going to be jumping back into it. But yeah, I am liking it, and I do think that, you know, if it only goes up from here, I will probably end up really liking this book. So I have high hopes. I am excited actually to continue reading this. And as far as my plans for this evening, I'm going to read this, but probably read a lot of it using my using the audiobook, because my original plan for this weekend, which I was hoping to do earlier today, but obviously here we are, is to bake cookies. So I have stuff that's part of what I got at the store today, is stuff to make cookies. So I thought it would be fun, especially since I knew I was going to want to listen to part of this on audiobook, to listen to the audiobook while I make cookies, and then probably switch back to the physical copy at some point this evening. And then the other thing that I have is a face mask that I got because, you know, I've got a nice little breakout going here. I thought this would be a nice little like self-care moment for me this weekend. And yeah, I think that that's the plan for tonight, is to bake some cookies, do my face mask, read this book. I did break it up into the 3 sections for this weekend, and I basically have to get through to chapter 21, page 218 if I want to like stay on track to get this done, and then maybe read like that last section tomorrow. But I also have some other things to read and do. I do need to tidy up my house. I have some grading to do. So I have some things to juggle, and obviously today was not the most productive day, but I also feel like that's okay because at the end of the day, this is kind of supposed to be like a self-care weekend, and if I need a day to catch up on some sleep and sit around and do nothing, then, you know, sometimes it's good to have one of those days every once in a while. So yeah, I am going to make some cookies now, and I will bring you guys along. So here we go. Hello, it is Sunday, and last night I got through part 1 of The Bear and the Nightingale by Katherine Arden, and I definitely understand what people mean when they say that it has a slow start, because in the description we're told that there's going to be like this conflict between Vazia and her stepmother, and how Vazia has these connections to the like spirits of their home and their forest, and how the stepmother doesn't want anything to do with those spirits. And we don't even learn of the stepmother, or like the stepmother isn't even introduced until towards the end of this very first section. So now starting part 2, which is chapter 12, I'm on page 95. Vazia is now 14, and I'm guessing we're going to get into a little more of like their conflict and everything else like that. I am liking it. I'm really liking the writing, and I do like the characters. I do like how it's structured. So basically what happens in this first section, we get a couple of chapters before Vazia is born. And then once Vazia is born, her mother dies. And then it jumps ahead to when Vazia is like 6. And at that point in time, Lily, she's this very like spunky girl who always likes to go into the forest, and she's very hard to manage. And basically it comes down to her... Sorry, Lily knocked my camera down. Okay. What was I even saying? The family basically comes to the conclusion that maybe their dad needs to finally remarry after 6 years have passed. And the dad's not too keen on the idea. Obviously, he was very much in love with his wife, and he misses her. And there's a little resentment, I think, because Vazia's mom like knew she was going to be a girl, knew she was going to have special powers, and therefore like wanted to ensure that she was born, even if she knew that she wasn't going to make it through her birth. And so he's not keen on the idea of going and finding a wife, but realizes that it's sort of necessary, and he's also going to look for maybe a husband for his daughter and maybe a wife for one of his sons. And so they travel to Moscow. It's interesting because we sort of leave Vazia at home, and we follow this whole journey with the dad and the 2 older sons, and some of like the political discussion between them and like the king, or like the prince guy, and one of the high priests. There's also the like fairy tale of Frost, the winter demon, which I think sort of parallels, like that fairy tale that we get in the very beginning of the story sort of parallels what I think may happen in the story. Yeah, so there's just been like some interesting moments throughout this that I wasn't really anticipating, and it hasn't quite, I don't really know what I was expecting. It hasn't quite gone in the direction that I thought it would. Is it slow towards the beginning? Yes. Am I still intrigued? Actually, yes. I want to know what happens, so that's good. But I do think that this one would have been a lot harder for me to get through had I not set it aside to specifically read during Polarthon. So I'm glad that this is kind of like one that I have sort of a deadline set for myself to try and finish this. Otherwise, I don't know if it's one that I would pick back up so readily. But basically, if I want to try and get this done before the end of Polarthon, I technically have to finish it before the end of today, which is fine. I think it's doable, especially if I continue to listen to the audiobook version, which I will be doing as I am continuing to make my cookies. You guys saw that I made up the cookie dough last night, but it's one of those that has to like set in the fridge overnight. So I'm going to take that out and actually bake some cookies while I listen to the audiobook, and I'm going to get started on part 2 of this and see what I think going forward and if I have any other thoughts. Basically, overall, I am liking it and I am very intrigued. So I'm curious to see, and my hope is that this might actually end up being a 5-star, because there are lots of things about this that I do really like, and I am thinking that if it just sort of like continues to pick up as the story goes on, that I'm just going to continue to like it that much more. And so yeah, this may be one that I actually really end up liking, and I may or may not continue with the trilogy. So we shall see, but let's go make some cookies. So keeping with the theme of Polarthon, I got these cute little like wintry cookie cutters that I'm going to use. And then I also got some royal icing, which I thought about making this myself, but the ingredient that I needed for it I didn't have at my store, so I just bought some with some food coloring and some sprinkles. And yeah, we're gonna do some cookie baking and decorating today. which means it is a couple days after this mini Polarthon readathon, and I have yet to wrap up this vlog slash update you really on what I read. I realize, thinking back, that I did not really give you a whole lot of updates throughout me actually reading this book. I didn't really update my progress a whole lot, so sorry for that. Thinking back, I'm not even really sure what all I vlogged, and I have not even like touched this video as far as editing anything, so I can't even tell you at this moment in time what this vlog will look like, so I hope that it's been okay up to this point. But the one really great thing to come out of this past weekend was the fact that I finished The Bear and the Nightingale by Katherine Arden, and I really loved it. I really, really loved it. So there were a few things that I had heard going into this book, which was, obviously it's a polar fantasy. It's very wintry, it's very atmospheric, like you really do feel like you're there in sort of this wintry setting, which I agree with, for sure. I definitely felt like I was in this world. I really liked the setting a lot, which is interesting because it's very much outside of anything that I've ever read before, but I did really enjoy it. I had also heard that it had a slow start, that it took a bit to kind of like get into the story, but once you did, it was worth it, which I also agree with. The whole first part, which I think I might have mentioned before, is just like setting up a lot of the background leading up to sort of the major conflict of the actual story. And so it did take a little bit to kind of like get through that part, but it was necessary in order to get to the good stuff that happened towards like the middle of the book and definitely into the end of the book. By the end of this, I was like flying through to see what would happen, and I really, really enjoyed it. I loved Vazia as our main character. I loved all of the magic. I love how she was sort of like discovering all of these different powers and gifts that she has. There was some like shifting in perspective a little bit, or maybe not shifting in perspective because it was all in third person, but there was some shift in focus, like which characters we were focusing on at different points in the story, besides just following Vazia the entire time, which I also liked that because I felt like it gave more to the story and there was a more well-rounded sense of what was going on. Also, like by the end of this, did I find myself attracted to a winter demon? I think so. As far as like the dangers that are happening in this story, I was definitely getting like Night King, White Walker vibes from this. If you're familiar with Game of Thrones, those were like some of the vibes I was getting out of the creatures that exist in this book, which I was digging a lot. This book is just beautifully written, and I kind of flipped back and forth between reading it physically and listening to it on audiobook, kind of as I was doing other things this weekend. And I did notice that I often had to go back and like reread parts that I had listened to on audiobook because I felt like there were moments that I didn't quite grasp what was happening or like which characters were saying which things. And also because it takes place in medieval Russia and is based on Russian folklore, there are obviously lots of Russian terms in this, and so there were moments where I was having to kind of refamiliarize myself with what she was actually talking about in here. Which there is a glossary in the back, which I didn't even realize until towards the end of reading this, which is fine. Like, it's still totally understandable, even if you're not familiar with like Russian history, because I'm definitely not. But I was just so pleasantly surprised by this book. Honestly, I was intimidated going into this book because it was something so outside my comfort zone, and I was like, oh my gosh, it is fantasy, which is something that I have not read a whole lot of recently. I thought because people said it was slow and maybe a little dense that I was like, oh, is it going to be like dry and boring? But it was absolutely not. I really enjoyed this book. I really, really enjoyed this book. And I am so glad that I set aside the time during this readathon to actually read this book, because I don't know if I would have picked it up otherwise. And now that I've read this first one, I am for sure going to be continuing with the trilogy. So I'm very excited that there are actually 2 more books that continue this story. So yeah, this is the one polar fantasy that I read during Jade's mini Polarthon retreat weekend. And I'm glad that I read this one. It was a good one, and I enjoyed myself this weekend. I had a little bit of self-care, and really I think that was the whole point, right? Give yourself a little self-care over the weekend, read a polar fantasy. Also, I'm wearing my snowman sweater to match my newly painted blue fingernails, and it all kind of goes along with like the polar fantasy theme. So again, I'm not really sure what this vlog is going to look like. It was my first experience of vlogging like a set readathon. But if you have made it to this point in the vlog, thank you so much for watching this video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. Let me know down in the comments if you participated in the Polarthon weekend retreat and what you read during that readathon, or if you have read The Bear and the Nightingale by Katherine Arden / her other books in this trilogy, and whether or not you liked it, because I was so very pleasantly surprised that I enjoyed this book so much. So success all around. Again, thanks so much for watching, and I will see you guys in my next video. Bye guys.